Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the United States. At its peak in 1983, when the reservoir reached full capacity, it contained roughly 28.9 million acre-feet of water. That is enough water to spread across the entire state of Pennsylvania to a depth of 1 foot, with billions of gallons still remaining. Lake Mead became the engineering centerpiece of the American Southwest, a massive infrastructure achievement that helped transform Las Vegas from a small railroad outpost into a metropolitan area of 2.8 million people. It provided the water that helped Phoenix rise into the 5th largest city in America and supported the transformation of California's Imperial Valley into the winter salad bowl of North America. Subscribe now for more shocking stories and hidden truths, because the next discovery might leave you speechless. Today, Lake Mead is only about 1/3 full. High along the canyon walls sits a massive white band that locals call the bathtub ring, positioned roughly 175 feet above the reservoir's current surface. Seen from the air, it stands out as one of the most dramatic scars across the American landscape. From the deck of a boat, the contrast is even more striking, making the surrounding canyons appear as though they were shaped by an entirely different river. But that white ring is more than just a mark left behind by disappearing water. It is a measurement, and when the documentation is examined closely, it reveals a much bigger story. The reality is that Lake Mead is not collapsing because of one unusually dry summer. It is not simply the result of climate change, and it cannot be explained by population growth across the Southwest, thirsty lawns in Phoenix, or fountains in Las Vegas. Those explanations may be easy to repeat, but they leave out the deeper problem. Lake Mead is declining because the legal, agricultural, and engineering system that built the modern American Southwest was based on a calculation that, even when it was made, was likely too optimistic. In 1922, 7 states, the federal government, and a generation of engineers came together and signed an agreement known as the Colorado River Compact. That agreement divided approximately 17.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water among the states every year. But the figure was calculated using river flow records from an unusually wet period. The actual long-term average flow of the Colorado River is much closer to 13 million acre-feet per year. That creates a difference of more than 4 million acre-feet every single year between the amount of water the system legally promises and the amount the river naturally delivers. For more than a century, that enormous gap has been quietly absorbed by Lake Mead and Lake Powell. These two giant reservoirs were built to act as buffers, storing water during better years and making up the difference when the river could not deliver what the legal system had promised. But those reservoirs are now running out of room to absorb the shortage. What hydrologists, dam engineers, and federal water managers are preparing for today is a situation the original system was never designed to withstand. The enormous white ring etched into the canyon walls is only the visible surface of a much larger problem. The figures written across the engineering schematics tell a story most people never see. 950 feet for power generation, 895 feet for water delivery, and a 55-foot danger zone between those two levels. These numbers may look like simple technical specifications, but once you understand what actually happens when Lake Mead crosses those thresholds, the entire situation becomes much clearer. It also explains why the second largest city in Nevada has already spent more than $1 billion constructing an escape route from a water system that has not officially failed yet. Las Vegas understands what may be coming. The rest of the country has barely been warned. To understand how Lake Mead became one of the most vulnerable pieces of infrastructure in America, you first have to go back to the document that created the modern Colorado River system, and to the fundamental mistake that was built into that agreement from the very beginning. The Colorado River Compact was signed on November 24, 1922, at Bishop's Lodge in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Representatives from 7 states took part in the agreement. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico represented the upper basin, while California, Arizona, and Nevada represented the lower basin. Also present was Herbert Hoover, who at the time served as Secretary of Commerce and chaired the negotiations. The purpose of the compact was to prevent a conflict over water. And this was not simply a political disagreement or a metaphorical war. The possibility of actual armed confrontation was becoming increasingly real. By the early 1920s, California was already diverting enormous quantities of Colorado River water through the Imperial Canal to irrigate farmland in the desert of the Imperial Valley. Arizona and the other basin states watched as California's agricultural economy expanded using water that passed through their territory. The tension continued to build. Arizona's governor had even threatened to deploy the state militia to stop California's diversions. Before the dispute could turn violent, the federal government stepped in. The answer was the Colorado River Compact, a legally binding agreement intended to divide the river's water among the states for generations to come. The upper basin would receive a guaranteed share. The lower basin would receive its own guaranteed allocation, and each state would be restricted from taking more than its designated portion. But there was one enormous question that had to be answered first. Exactly how much water did the Colorado River actually have to divide? Engineers examined the river's historical records, particularly the measurements collected between 1899 and 1921. They calculated the average flow and arrived at a figure of approximately 17.5 million acre-feet of water flowing through the Colorado River system each year. That number became the foundation for everything that came afterward. The compact allocated 7.5 million acre-feet to the upper basin and another 7.5 million acre-feet to the lower basin, with additional water set aside for Mexico and future development. But there was a problem hiding inside those calculations. The years used to establish that average, from 1899 through 1921, were among the wettest periods the region had experienced in roughly 1,200 years. We know that today because of tree rings. Bristlecone pines and other extremely long-lived trees growing throughout the Colorado River Basin preserve a detailed record of changing climate conditions. Their annual rings reveal periods of abundant rainfall as well as prolonged drought. By studying those trees, scientists have been able to reconstruct the history of Colorado River flows going back roughly to 800 AD. The reconstruction revealed something critical. The early 20th century, the exact period used to determine the Colorado River Compact's allocations, was not representative of normal conditions. It was an unusually wet period. During those decades, the Colorado River carried significantly more water than it had on average throughout the previous 1,000 years. The long-term average flow of the Colorado River is not 17.5 million acre-feet per year. It is closer to 13 million. That means the compact effectively promised the states about 4.5 million acre-feet of water every year that the river, on average, simply does not produce. And this problem was not completely invisible in 1922. Some of the engineers involved in the negotiations questioned the reliability of the available data. They pointed out that the measurement period was too short and warned that examining a much longer historical record could produce a very different average. But those concerns were ultimately dismissed. The states wanted access to more water. The federal government wanted to prevent conflict. So the compact was signed, and the modern American Southwest was built around a water allocation that exceeded the river's sustainable capacity by roughly 25%. For decades, that imbalance remained hidden because Lake Mead was designed specifically to absorb the difference. Hoover Dam, originally known as Boulder Dam, was completed in 1936 during the depths of the Great Depression. At the time, it was the largest dam ever built, Thousands of workers were employed in its construction, and the massive structure became a symbol of American engineering power and determination. Behind the dam, Lake Mead slowly began filling. The concept was straightforward. During wet years, the reservoir would store excess water. During dry years, that stored water could be released to maintain supplies. The compact promised a specific amount of water, but the river itself could not deliver a fixed amount every year. Its flow changed with snowpack, rainfall, and runoff. Lake Mead was supposed to absorb those fluctuations, and throughout much of the 20th century, the system appeared to work. Wet years raised the reservoir. Dry years lowered it. Then the cycle repeated. Meanwhile, cities expanded, farms spread across the desert, and the American Southwest transformed into one of the most populated and economically productive regions on the continent. Lake Mead eventually reached its historic peak in 1983. The reservoir rose to a surface elevation of 1,225 feet and held approximately 28.9 million acre-feet of water. The canyon walls disappeared beneath the waterline. Marina docks floated high above the surrounding cliffs. Everything appeared to be functioning exactly the way engineers had intended. But that was the high point. The decline began in 2000. From 2000 through 2021, the Colorado River Basin entered what hydrologists initially described as a prolonged drought. Annual river flows remained below historical averages, while snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the primary source of the river's water, also declined. Lake Mead began losing water. At first, the change was barely noticeable. The reservoir dropped only a few feet each year, a relatively small change for a body of water of this enormous size. Then the decline began accelerating. By 2010, Lake Mead had fallen below 1,100 feet, a level it had not reached since the reservoir was still being filled during the 1930s. By 2015, the elevation had fallen below 1,080 feet. Then came 2021. The Bureau of Reclamation declared the first official shortage on the Colorado River, triggering mandatory water reductions for Arizona and Nevada under a Tier 1 shortage. By 2022, the situation had worsened, and the shortage level was elevated to Tier 2A. And by 2024, Lake Mead had fallen to elevations that pushed federal officials to begin using terminology in official documents that had previously been considered almost unthinkable. They stopped describing the situation simply as a drought. Instead, they began using the term aridification, and that distinction is far more important than it may sound. A drought is temporary. Eventually, the drought ends. Rain returns, mountain snowpack can recover, and reservoirs can begin filling again. Aridification is something fundamentally different. It describes a permanent shift in the region's baseline climate. It is not a temporary departure from normal conditions that eventually disappears. It means the definition of normal itself is changing, creating a drier climate that may not reverse. Over the past decade, the scientific picture has become increasingly clear. The American Southwest is not simply going through another drought that will eventually come to an end. The region is moving toward a persistently drier climate state that could define its long-term future. The unusually wet period used to establish the Colorado River Compact was the anomaly. The much drier conditions now emerging may actually represent a return toward the region's longer-term average, and Lake Mead was never designed to handle that kind of permanent transformation. The reservoir was built to absorb temporary ups and downs in water supply. It cannot indefinitely compensate for a permanent reduction in the amount of water entering the system. The bathtub ring makes the problem impossible to ignore. That enormous white band stretching across the canyon walls is made largely of calcium carbonate and other mineral deposits left behind as the water level receded. It is a natural record of where the water once stood. It shows exactly how far the reservoir has fallen, approximately 175 feet. That is not simply another fluctuation in a normal cycle. It is not just another drought that can be waited out. It represents a deeper structural problem in the water system supporting roughly 40 million people. And what turns Lake Mead's decline from a serious crisis into an emergency are the critical thresholds built directly into Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam was designed around two essential functions. First, it generates electricity. Second, it releases water downstream for cities, farms, and other users. Both of those functions depend on one thing: maintaining enough water inside Lake Mead. The first major threshold is 950 feet. At approximately 950 feet of surface elevation, the falling water level begins affecting the efficiency of Hoover Dam's hydroelectric turbines. The pressure pushing water through the system becomes weaker, making it increasingly difficult for the generators to operate at full capacity. There is also a growing risk of cavitation, the formation of damaging air bubbles that can harm the machinery. Once Lake Mead falls below 950 feet, the dam's ability to produce electricity begins deteriorating rapidly. And that matters because Hoover Dam supplies power to roughly 1.3 million people across Nevada, Arizona, and California. The facility produces around 4 billion kilowatt hours of electricity each year. Replacing that enormous amount of generation would require alternative power sources, and the region does not currently have enough spare capacity to simply replace it without consequences. But the power generation threshold is not the most severe one. That point comes at 895 feet. At 895 feet, Lake Mead reaches what the Bureau of Reclamation officially calls deadpool. At that elevation, the water surface falls below the dam's lowest outlet works. Gravity can no longer move water through Hoover Dam. The reservoir effectively becomes a bathtub whose drain sits above the remaining water level. Nothing can pass through. Once deadpool is reached, Hoover Dam would effectively cease performing its primary functions. No electricity generation, no downstream water releases, and no normal deliveries to the lower basin, states that depend on those releases. The Colorado River would continue flowing into Lake Mead, but the water would no longer be able to flow back out through Hoover Dam. Everything downstream of Hoover Dam, the canals, aqueducts, farms, and cities, depends on water continuing to pass through the dam. Between 950 and 895 feet lies a 55-foot zone where the system gradually loses functionality. With every foot the lake drops, power generation and water delivery become more difficult. Below 895 feet, the system effectively stops. Lake Mead is currently estimated to be only about 50 to 60 feet above deadpool. That might sound like a safe margin, but in a severe year, the reservoir can lose 20 feet or more. Evaporation alone removes roughly 600,000 acre-feet of water every year. At the current rate of consumption and under worsening climate conditions, the remaining buffer could disappear within just a few bad years. Federal water managers are already planning for that possibility. Las Vegas understood the danger early. The city gets roughly 90% of its water from Lake Mead. Without the reservoir, supporting a metropolitan area of 2.8 million people would become nearly impossible. So in the early 2000s, the Southern Nevada Water Authority began preparing for the question nobody wanted to answer. What happens if Lake Mead reaches deadpool? The existing Las Vegas intake system would eventually sit above the remaining water. The city could still have water in the lake, but it would no longer be able to reach it. The solution was the third straw. Construction began in 2008 on a massive underground intake tunnel designed to reach deeper into Lake Mead. The project took 7 years and cost approximately $1.5 billion. Completed in 2015, its intake was positioned roughly 860 feet below the deadpool threshold. That means Las Vegas could continue accessing water even if Hoover Dam could no longer release it downstream. Las Vegas spent $1.5 billion building the third straw because it knows how serious the Lake Mead threat could become. Phoenix has no similar escape route. About 40% of Phoenix's water comes through the 336-mile Central Arizona project, which carries Colorado River water across the desert. Arizona also has junior water rights, meaning it faces cuts before states with senior rights. The 2021 shortage alone reduced Arizona's allocation by 512,000 acre-feet. Then there is California's Imperial Valley. This extremely dry desert region depends heavily on Colorado River water, delivered through the 80-mile All-American Canal, supporting roughly 500,000 acres of farmland. Imperial Valley has senior water rights, so during shortages, cities can face cuts before its farms do. That creates one of the biggest political tensions in the Colorado River crisis. Around 80% of Colorado River water goes to agriculture, including huge amounts of water-intensive alfalfa, much of which is exported for livestock feed. Cities conserve, farmers reduce planting. But the underlying problem remains. The system promises 17.5 million acre-feet. The river provides closer to 13 million. Lake Mead has absorbed that gap for decades. Now it is running out of room. And as the water retreats, it is exposing what was hidden beneath the reservoir. Old boats, underwater structures, and even human remains have appeared. In 2022, a barrel containing human remains was discovered near Hemingway Harbor, followed by additional discoveries. Lake Mead is revealing its secrets, just as the Colorado River system is revealing its deeper problems. The Southwest is becoming hotter and drier, making recovery increasingly uncertain. This is not simply a drought, it is aridification. The 55-foot margin above deadpool is becoming a countdown. At 895 feet, Hoover Dam can no longer deliver water normally. Roughly 40 million people depend on this system, which was built around water the river cannot reliably provide. For a century, Lake Mead held everything together. Now it is running out. Las Vegas built the third straw. The rest of the Southwest is still waiting for the lake to recover. But the bathtub ring keeps rising, and the mathematics are becoming impossible to ignore.